Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Blue Values Journey podcast featuring Professor Rose Boswell, the South African Research Chair in Ocean Cultures and Heritage. I'm David, your host, and this episode is all about coastal displacement. We'll jump straight into Rose's answer to my question, which is, why does the topic of coastal displacement matter in the context of ocean cultures and heritage?
Coastal dispossession is really important in our work that we're doing in coastal cultural heritage because many people in Southern Africa in particular have been dispossessed of their land, and that dispossession has happened along the coast. The impact of that dispossession has been to deny local people access to the coast and to make it very difficult for them to express and experience their intangible cultural heritage. It's absolutely vital for us to understand that human connection with the sea, and it is very difficult for us to carry that out if people have been forcibly removed from the coast and are no longer able to exist in that context or practice their cultural heritage in that context. In South Africa, for example, the isiXhosa people, indigenous peoples of South Africa, as well as those who are now known as the First Nations or the Aboriginal peoples of South Africa, the Khoisan, have a long and really meaningful relationship with the ocean. For the isiXhosas, there is this idea that the ancestors are residing in the ocean, that there is another world in the ocean space and in the sort of water space that enables them to facilitate spiritual restoration and spiritual healing. And so if local people known as the Xhosas, for example, if they can't access the ocean, then it means that they are forced to basically use other water spaces in order to realize their ritual practices. Of course, this did happen under the apartheid regime, and it still happens today that people use a variety of water sources, streams, rivers that are deemed spiritually meaningful. But the ocean really is one of the main spaces where spiritual ritual actions can take place. Insofar as the First Nations or Aboriginal peoples are concerned, we now know that many of their ancestors used to live along the coastline, especially in the Southern Cape, and that there are a series of really ancient and ritually meaningful caves along that coast that they were able to access. And with apartheid and with the segregation of the population and residential segregation as well, it meant that people were removed from those spaces. In Namibia, we have a story that is very similar to South Africa. The population was also displaced under a similar apartheid regime. In fact, Namibia was part of South Africa for many, many years. It was previously known as Southwest Africa. And the coastal populations were displaced and moved inland and into the kinds of places that today we would describe as townships. This was certainly the case, for example, in Windhoek, the capital city of Namibia. Even today, if we look at a map of Namibia, we'll see that there is a red line which basically demarcates the northern part of Namibia from the southern and the eastern parts of Namibia. And that was a cordon sanitaire, or a health boundary, which was critical to preventing infected livestock from moving into places that were ostensibly farmlands. So it's very, very important to understand Namibia, I think, not only as a place where people were moving in and out of the sort of coastal areas, or being displaced rather from the coastal areas, but that those forms of spatialization, the apartheid spatialization, remains today. And we can see that in the fact of the continued existence of the red line, and it's highly contested. People are saying that this still reinforces the apartheid regime, as it were. And In part, we can also see it with the creation of national parks. There are 12 national parks in Namibia. We know from historical studies that indigenous peoples known as the Nama and the San, for example, were in some instances forcibly removed from those areas further east, away from the coast and away from those national parks. Another thing that we also realized in the research that we were doing in these coastal areas is how the national parks, in a way, demarcate areas for the conservation of nature and the respect of nature, but the border of some of these parks basically indicate what constitutes areas set aside for mining and for industrial use and areas that ought to be conserved. It's quite a blunt boundary, especially if we look at the Dorob National Park in particular, which runs all the way down the coast. We did some field research in an area outside of Walfish Bay called Gobabeb, that's slightly further south. We did field work in a place called Arandis, which is just on the other side of the Dorob boundary. And Arandis is an interesting space, but also a place that one would be very concerned about if one had to live there. Because after our interviews, we found that Arandis is quite close to a number of uranium mines. And the interviews that we had with local people about where did they live before, some indicated they had lived at the coast, because we were pursuing this question of what does a sea mean to you? You live inland. Does a sea mean anything to you? Were you among those who were forcibly removed from the coast? And some related that story. But others began to tell us about the illnesses that they had experienced as a result of working directly with the uranium substance, which in Namibia is known as yellow cake.
My understanding is that some of those people who were forcefully removed, displaced, relocated, the ocean was really important for them culturally and historically. They were not able to get to the ocean for their ritual practices. Is that right? What happened over there?
Yes. So in the case of the Topna peoples, who are sometimes referred to as people of the sea, they were forcibly relocated from the town of Walfish Bay to a place, a desert area called Gobabeb, which is further inland. And they literally had to develop an understanding of and a reliance on a desert plant called the Ngara plant, which is like a melon and it's very creamy inside and it has a high fat content. They were fortunate that the Ngara plant actually existed because prior to that, their diet was very much based on seafood. They were also fishermen, recreational fishermen. They were small scale fishermen. And so they were now in a situation where they completely had to change their diet in order to live in this environment. And it's really astonishing how they were able to maintain a level of cultural resilience because when we were in the community again in December of 2023, they showed us the many different dishes that they make with the Ngara plant. We also got the opportunity to taste the plant. It's almost like a custard apple. They also showed us their dances, the Namastap or Namastep dance. The Tokna people were also nostalgic about their previous life with the ocean. And today, in places such as Walfish Bay, but specifically Swakopmund, there are still some small-scale fishers. There are people known as the bicycle fishermen. So they cycle in from the local township all the way to the coast because, again, the coast of Swakopmund is bed and breakfast. It's the cafes and the restaurants and the upmarket residential areas that were demarcated for racialized occupation, for white occupation under the apartheid regime. So they cycle in and they fish off the pier and at the coast. And as in South Africa, they are subject to a process of permitting. So they need to have special permits, fishing permits, in order to be able to access the sea. And permits have to be renewed on a regular basis. Sometimes they don't have the money to renew that license, that permit, and they can be fined. And so these are people who had a historical connection with the sea and now have intermittent access to it through a government regulated system. At the same time, there are huge commercial interests in the Namibian fishing industry. It is something that is obviously helping Namibia, and I think we can be clear on that. But many of the commercial trawlers that are operating in Namibia are foreign commercial trawlers. In fact, there was a huge story that broke out. It was in 2023 called fish rot. And I would encourage listeners to go and read up on that because it's a very complex fraud and corruption case involving a European commercial fishing company and people who facilitated their access to the bounty, really, of Namibia's fishing industry.
Germany has pledged money to Namibia. What's happening there?
In May of 2021, Germany paid some 1.1 billion euros to the Namibian government for development aid and as a form of reparation to the people for the massacres that occurred under the German regime in Namibia back in the early 1900s. And the local community were grateful in part for this symbol of reparation, but on the other hand, they were deeply frustrated that there had not been individual reparations because, and as we found when we were doing field research in the southern towns of Betani and Keetmanshoop, there are many families that were directly affected by those massacres, the husbands and fathers and grandfathers that had been taken away and tortured and killed in that period of time. And so, as I said, 1.1 billion has been paid over. I suppose it's going to happen in tranches. I'm not sure of the exact details, but some 54 million of that money has also been set aside for reconciliation projects, for remembrance projects. And that's critical to the story of cultural heritage in Namibia, I feel. And certainly the National Heritage Council can really benefit from that support because we certainly saw in our anthropological research I talked about Gobabeb earlier on, there are places that have what look like the remains of concentration camps, but those are basically just rubble today. There's nothing there to mark that space as an area that was critical in the suffering of indigenous Namibians. And one could add more. We've traveled the length and the breadth of Namibia and heard so many stories about what has happened to local people under the previous regime, the colonial regime, and what needs to be done for restitution to happen. So it's really not just about the provision of space and place for commemorative buildings or monuments, but it is about the restitution of intangible cultural heritage in Namibia, the recognition and the respect that ought to be afforded to that. And that's something that we really hope to see emerging in that country now that this funding, the symbol of reparation, has been received.
Could you talk a little bit about the Blue Values journey that you were involved in with a couple of participants from these groups of people who were displaced, dispossessed, relocated?
We also traveled northeast into two towns, Tsumeb and Sinsabis, where there are people known as the Haikom people who are San descendants. And many of them, because of the forced removals and the fact of just basically of distance between Tsumeb and the coast, Swakopmund and Walvis Bay, very few people had actually been to the ocean. Even our earlier conversations with the Himba peoples in the northern part of Namibia, that showed that some of them had never seen the ocean at all. They thought of the ocean as a great river. That's because obviously rivers and floodplains are what people are familiar with in the northern part of the country. But in the case of two individuals who we took with us on the first Blue Values journey in Namibia, we took them to the coast, to Swakopmund, and the one person had not seen the ocean in 20 years. not just because of the distance to the ocean, but also because of the impact of apartheid on her family, the fact of being forcibly removed from a place that was closer to the sea. We were curious there as well to ask the question of what does the sea mean to you? Because we really wanted to know, is the sea meaningful to people who are living inland? And that was certainly relayed to us. They shared that there are specific rituals when you go to the ocean, that you need to go into the water up to your knees, and that you need to take some of the seawater, you need to put it in your mouth, and you need to wash your face with it. And the reason for that is you are indicating your respect and your reverence for the sea, but at the same time, you are showing that you're also part of the sea by putting some of that water in your mouth. And you're imploring the ocean to basically ensure your safe passage because the ocean is powerful. And so just to see the expression on this woman's face, and she asked us, does it move like that all the time? Does it go and it come like that all the time? She's referring to the tides and the waves. And it struck us that the ocean was for her a concept that she hadn't, because it was so long ago that she had seen the sea and had been with the sea, she could not even remember the fundamental aspects of the tide and the waves, which is something that we know and we take for granted. So there are many people who have not experienced the ocean as a result of coastal dispossession. One other group that we engaged in Windhoek, and we hope to organize a visit to the ocean for these people as well. It's an NGO that is doing phenomenal work with gender empowerment called Sister Namibia. Sister Namibia works with young San women to rebuild their self-esteem, to help them if they have been living in communities where there's potential violence and abuse. And many of the young women that we heard about at Sister Namibia, we were told that these women have never seen the sea. So one of the journeys that we wish to undertake in the future is to take a group of young women from Windhoek to Swakopmund so that they can know what the ocean is.